Who's ready for some JavaScript and really geeky technical SEO? Right before the food. Good placement. Okay. So before I dive in, just to give you guys some context, the company I founded is called Kahena. We work on some really interesting projects, large clients, but we keep a pretty low profile. We used to do a conference called KahenaCon, which Liraz mentioned. We haven't in recent years. Maybe we'll consider doing it again. So we've been in business 8 years. We're a team of 19, all native English speakers from the US and other English-speaking countries. So our main headquarters is in Jerusalem. We've got 24 clients currently, SEO, SEM, and a bit of paid social. We're about, you can't see that, but 50-50 B2B, B2C. 70% of what we do is SEO, and that's really our core DNA. And we've expanded recently into PPC, and it's growing like crazy because, well, you know, Google's taking all of the clicks there, so we also have to do PPC. And I'd say we work a lot with US retail e-commerce companies, so large brands, and we also work with increasingly local B2B SaaS startups and companies. So just a few of our B2C clients, like I said, mostly US-based, and some of our local Israeli B2B clients. Cool. Okay, so before we dive in, so I don't know, JavaScript can kind of feel like the Matrix sometimes. So I just kind of want to get a show of hands. Raise your hand if you feel like you have a good handle on JavaScript and SEO related issues. Okay, good. How many of you have heard of the DOM before, or the Document Object Model? Raise them high. All right, good. And how many of you of those people feel like you know the difference between like the DOM and, let's say, view source? All right. There's more for that than knew what the DOM was, so I'm not sure that makes sense, but okay. Let's review some of the basics of how web page content is requested and rendered. We'll cover these really briefly. You guys like my clip art, my Microsoft clip art? Yeah, cool. Great. So your site is making a request. It's going to go through the ISP, through a DNS, get an IP. It's going to ask the web server for that URL, and it's going to come back to your computer, okay, in that response. And that's going to go through a couple steps. So your server is probably running Microsoft or Linux, and on that is either IIS or Apache or Nginx or something like that. And the next layer is going to be a content management system, right? So whether it's WordPress or Demandware or Magento, whatever it is, or maybe something custom. So that content management system is going to send back a response through those steps. And that response is going to be a header, right? And we're not talking about the HTML head, but a header. And then it's going to have a body. And that body response, that main core response, is what most of us know as view source, right? Is that source response. Am I cutting in and out? There we go. Good. And that response is, like I said, is what we know as view source. That's what we're all used to when we want to like see what's under the hood of a web page. And what I want to make sure, if for those that really don't know a lot about JavaScript or JavaScript and SEO, if there's one thing that you take away is kind of understanding this concept of the DOM, or the Document Object Model, which is very different than the view source. So this thing is like a living document. It changes as the page loads, and it also changes as things happen on that site. So if you click around, or even non-click events, that's going to change this DOM, this living document. So first, what happens is, right, your browser is going to read the HTTP header and the body. It's going to read that view source. And it's going to read that top to bottom, and it's going to build that based on the HTML and CSS. And then what happens, it's going to request additional resources. And that could be like images, CSS, JavaScript files. And then and only then is it going to execute the JavaScript. But at each stage in that process, the DOM is changing. It's alive. And to be clear, what happens is that this structured document, which a lot of you may know as inspect element, right? That's another way of thinking about the DOM, is when you inspect element, this is going to change and always be different. Really kind of important concept to understand. So with that knowledge, I think you'll ultimately come to the conclusion in so many ways that viewing source, at least for SEO purposes, is effectively dead. But also there's a caveat to that, and we'll get there by the end. So raise your hands if you work or consult for websites that utilize some form of JavaScript, or that you think, okay, it's probably more than you realize. And of those, raise your hands if you use any sort of like server-side rendering or pre-rendering, or you've heard of that. All right, cool. So devs love JavaScript. They like talking about it. They like comparing what's the newest framework. It's very popular right now. And so if you kind of think of the evolution of web development, we've come a long way, and I think JavaScript is really at the forefront of modern front-end web development. And I got this stat from DeepCrawl, but like more than 90% of sites are using some form of JavaScript. Yeah, there may be some includes and some libraries, but a lot of them are using JavaScript, and it's becoming more and more the sort of primary way of developing a site. So if you hear your dev team or talking about the roadmap, or your clients say things like Angular or React, you better be on your toes, because that's when this is happening. Okay, so I, as an SEO, at the bare minimum, also just knowing some of the names of these frameworks or some of this terminology, because you may be on a shared email, you may be talking to your devs, and over here, yeah, we're thinking about redoing the front end of the site. You won't notice a thing, but we're building it all in React. Or we're going to make it a single-page application. That is when you need to have your ears perked, because that means that you'll have a lot of work ahead of you. So how is JavaScript rendered? There's really sort of two ways, and I'm going to simplify this. There's server-side, and then there's client-side. Okay, so server-side simply means that the JavaScript on the on the server is going to be rendered there, and then you're going to get HTML and CSS static to your browser. So that's like kind of like old web. It's as if your browser's not getting any JavaScript, and it's rendered before it comes to your web page. Client-side is what a lot of sites do now, is they send the JavaScript to your browser, and they let your browser do the work. So your browser is the one that's doing the heavy lifting and the processing, and it's rendering all of that HTML and CSS. I'm simplifying that a little bit, but it's the difference between who's doing the heavy lifting, who's rendering and processing that JavaScript. So some important sort of items of JavaScript that are important for SEO and important for you as SEOs or digital marketers to kind of understand. So Ajax. Anyone heard of Ajax? You probably have all seen it. You may not realize that it's called that. So if you're on an e-commerce website and you are filtering in a category and you want to see small to large, or you want to filter by size, and then you see that little spinny guy, that's Ajax. And what's happening is the browser is talking to the server and through JavaScript and SQL, and it's getting content dynamically. And remember we talked about the DOM? That means that the living document, the document object model, is changing and getting new content, which would look very different than view source. So why do we care? Google and other search engines may not be able to see that content or navigate to pages linked to from that function. Push date, right? So have you ever seen where you're browsing on a site, it's usually in single-page applications, where you click something, the URL changes, but you don't feel like the browser reloaded a page? That's push date changes, okay? Most of the time. And what that means is that Google or other search engines, depending on how it's coded, may not be able to find that next page, right? So a user can, but there's no real way that the search engines are able to, or at least used to. There's also post-load events, so you load a page, there's a spinny something or a loady something, and then content's loaded. Search engines may not be able to see that. And then lazy loading. You've all seen this. You're scrolling, and images load as you're scrolling. Not endless scrolling, but like it's called lazy loading. It's another very popular thing. It's not a big deal, but you definitely need to see that content isn't loading there. Okay, so why does all of this matter? How does or did Google render JavaScript? So until about 2 months ago, Google was using Chrome 41, which is from 2015, to render the JavaScript on your site, right? So they come along, they see your source code, and later, which we'll talk about, they render the JavaScript, but using a browser as if you were browsing from 2015. That means all the fancy stuff that your developers have implemented since 2015, they're not going to be able to see it or render it. So the most modern version is 75 from June. Just recently in May, Google announced that, hey, don't worry, Googlebot is evergreen now. That means that the version of Googlebot, like how they render JavaScript, is in line with the browser that you use on your desktop or your laptop or whatever, which is all great. It sounds wonderful. This is something really critical to understand, and this is another key takeaway from this. When Google first comes along and crawls and indexes a page, it's processing the view source only. Okay, so that view source that we talked about. Therefore, the only thing that gets read in index is the view source on the first pass. And only on the second pass, okay, which could be weeks or even months later, do they render the JavaScript. Yeah, now with a modern browser, but it's still on a huge delay. And that's critical, okay? So just try to think about why this matters. Imagine that you have internal links coded in the JavaScript, right? Those links aren't going to get read, and Google or other engines now won't find those second or third tier pages that are linked to until weeks or months later. So if you made a change to a second tier or third tier page and it's only linked to or referenced in JavaScript, it doesn't matter that Google knows how to render it. It's happening later. Another key takeaway is the speed at which they come back and process this queue of JavaScript rendering is related to, we think, the strength of your site, right? So this is really critical to understand, is that it's very resource intensive, right? This takes a lot of time, a lot of server use. They don't want to do this as fast as you would want them to. So what about other search engines? So Bing, Baidu, DuckDuckGo, if you want, they're further behind than Google. And Ellie said that Google, they know how to protect people from dying. Well, they also really struggle, unfortunately, to process JavaScript. And so they're getting there, and I think we will be in a day where it won't matter, but today it really doesn't matter to know how to deal with this. The other thing is like social networks too, right? So when your users share a URL on Facebook or on Twitter, the snippet that shows up is going to be based on the view source. Facebook's not rendering the JavaScript, LinkedIn's not rendering JavaScript, so if you want that snippet to look good, you need to make sure that stuff is rendered pre-rendered properly. So what the heck do we do about all of this? Okay, how am I on time? All right, good. So the first thing we can do is just say, yeah, well, Google said that they're all good. They know how to render JavaScript, and we can just trust them. I don't necessarily think that that's a good idea. There used to be an old model for dealing with AJAX called escaped fragment. If somebody mentions this to you, or if a dev brings this up, or you're still doing this, don't. It doesn't work anymore and can cause a lot of issues. So yeah, don't do that. Server-side rendering and pre-rendering. Okay. So server-side rendering, as I said a little bit earlier, is rendering.
Can you go back for a minute?
Yeah.
You said server maps from Apply.
Say that again.
What's the?
I'm saying that this model called escaped fragment, or the AJAX crawling scheme from Google, is no longer supported. So I'm saying don't do this. Okay. Server-side rendering is basically taking all of the JavaScript and rendering it on your server. So letting the server process and render all of it, and then serving that to your browser or the bot, okay? So giving users and the bots the same pre-rendered content, that's what server-side or pre-rendering is, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. So the way that you do this is with something on your own site, like a script that's gonna do that, or a third-party service. So I'll give you an example. So prerender.io is just one of a few, where we're saying, before Google is coming along to read it, or other search engines or users, I'm going to take that dynamic JavaScript and give it to a third-party API. It's going to process it, come back, and then serve it to the user or search engines, okay? That's pre-rendering. You could do a whole talk on this, but just to understand what that concept means, Google has their own. It's called Puppeteer, and it's really advanced. And you can use this to do the same thing, and it's just like your devs install it on the server, and then Puppeteer can pre-render that content and serve it to users and bots. Everybody's happy. The devs get to use JavaScript, the users and the bots get pre-rendered HTML and CSS. All right. The most advanced, or I'd say that the gold standard right now, is dynamic rendering. And I think you're going to see us moving in this direction, and if you have the time to invest in this, dynamic rendering is the way to go. I called it dynamic serving in the talk, but it's actually called dynamic rendering. And the way that this works is that It's basically sanctioned cloaking. So how many of you guys know what cloaking is or have heard of that? Okay, so the scary stuff we know about. So cloaking is when Google said, don't serve users and bots different things. Don't try to detect when bots are coming and give them like, I don't know, a bunch of spammy, keywordy text, and then give users this beautiful graphic user interface. So now Google is saying, yeah, actually, yeah, you can do that as long as you follow these guidelines. And you can serve us pre-rendered HTML, and you can serve users JavaScript. So the way that this works is exactly as I said, is that the server can send us users, our browsers, HTML and JavaScript, and they can send the crawlers or the bots that you defined pre-rendered static HTML. Okay, so I really like this graphic. It sums it up really nicely. So this is Google and Bing sanctioned cloaking. All right, and the way that this happens, I'll give you sort of an example from one of our clients. On the left is how a browser would load HTML with JavaScript. Okay, this is all rendered with JavaScript. It's built on React, I think. And I've got this plugin up there. If you can see the little green check, that's JavaScript on. And on the right, in the upper right, you see JavaScript is off, and literally you cannot see a thing. Like the whole site is built on JavaScript. So this is a great plugin that you can install in your browser. And if you want to see, is your site using JavaScript, or how does it load if JavaScript's not being rendered, uncheck it and refresh. So what we did is with dynamic rendering, so I'm changing my user agent to Googlebot. So I'm changing as if I'm Google coming along. And you see the JavaScript is still off. The page loads fine. And what's happening there is before, with JavaScript off, all of that browser JavaScript rendering isn't happening. And now the server knows that or thinks that it's Google, and it's serving them just HTML and CSS. That's dynamic rendering. And the benefits here is that instead of doing it for every user and using all that server time and making the site maybe a little bit slower because it's pre-rendering the JavaScript before it sends it, it's only to bots. And so you're only doing that for the bots. You're not doing it for every user. It's a win-win. Oh, wait, go back. So as you can see, we can define who are the bots that we care about, okay? And then this is just like a bit of code from Puppeteer's instructions. So you can do this for Instagram, for Facebook, for social networks, for Google, for Bing, for Baidu. Any site that you want to get pre-rendered content, you can do that for. Okay, so wrapping this up with some tools and pro tips. So we mentioned view source is dead. Not necessarily. So for us SEOs, the biggest thing you need to think about is to go into view source and make sure that your title tag, your meta description, your canonical tags, your meta robots, your hreflangs, your page copy, and navigational links, your internal links, that's critical, you can see them in your view source. Because if not, but you see them in the browser, but you don't see them in the view source, they're in JavaScript. And it means that Google won't see them until they come back and render the JavaScript weeks or a month or whatever later. So that's critical, that you see that stuff that you care, everything that you care about as an SEO, you kind of want to see in view source, all right? Also, if you want to make your case to management or developers and so on, show visually how Google sees the page, right? So use the URL inspection tool in Google Search Console, use the mobile testing tool. It's public. You can do it on other sites too. So you can say, look at our site, look at competitor site. And you can see how it's rendering. I highly recommend doing this. It's simple, but it's very, very effective. And just a few takeaways. So if you have JavaScript on your site without server-side or pre-rendering, demand from your developers or your team or whoever that the core SEO elements are in the HTML source. So title, canonical, meta robots, that stuff, you want to get it processed on that first go-around. You don't want to wait. And then secondly, use auditing tools to make your case. So Google's own tools. And then remove JavaScript and take screenshots. Show how bad it looks. That's what Google's seeing, at least on their first pass. And then lastly, invest in longer-term solutions like pre-rendering or dynamic rendering. It's good for SEO. It's good for bots. It's good for performance. And I believe that this is going to be the gold standard for dealing with JavaScript for all defined bots in the future. So hopefully you took away something, knowing the difference between DOM and view source, knowing a little bit more about pre-rendering, server-side rendering, dynamic rendering. And if all else fails, there's a lot written on the internet about this, and I'm happy to share. So yeah, that's it. Thanks.